All right, we're gonna get started in just a moment. All right, I'm getting confirmations that it's working now. I'm not sure. It was messing with the orientation, and it was doing all kinds of crazy shit. So all right, let's get started. These questions are on esoteric philosophy, the occult, magic, whatever you want to call it. Um, these are questions that I've gotten over the last several months, maybe even a year collectively, from friends, clients, customers, viewers on the channel. But yeah, let's go ahead and hop into it. I hope you're all having a good night so far, wherever you are. We got a lot of questions here. First question tonight is, how do the Qliphoth or the Qliphoth relate to chaos magic? Okay, so chaos magic is a pretty broad term, especially these days. When it was originally coined, chaos magic was a practice of taking multiple systems and combining them together and using what worked. So somebody might take a little bit of Buddhism, they might take a little bit of Christianity, they might throw in some folk magic and poetry, and that was chaos magic. Or somebody might take one system and they might pull it apart and take just the things that they like. They might look at Christianity and say, well, I like the idea of the communion and I like the idea of prayer, but I'll leave all the other stuff. This is chaos magic. And as most people would define it. The Qliphoth are essentially the part of the soul. It's the reservoir where all of the repressed memories, repressed ideas, things that we don't want to deal with, things that we don't think are desirable about us. So you could say that they're related through the idea of negation and repression, I suppose. But there isn't really a direct relationship, I don't think, unless your definition of chaos magic is bringing the chaos current in, or the current of death or change or putrefaction, so to speak. So no direct relation, but we can always draw lines between things if we want to. What is the link between demonology? Oh, this was a two-part question. I'm sorry. So the link between demonology and the Qliphoth is, it is said that the Qliphoth is an infernal realm, as opposed to the Sephiroth, which are the celestial or Empyrean realm. So each one of the Qliphoth or Qlipha is said to be ruled by something called an archdemon. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, if we think about demons from a psychological perspective, it could be the parts of us that are impulsive, the parts of us that um, are imbalanced. So an archdemon might be something like an addiction or something like that. Now, speaking spiritually, an archdemon is typically either a conglomerate, a collective consciousness of several entities, or it is one that overarches multiple planes, so to speak. Next question. Oh, looks like Dr. Zero is back again. Hello again. How's it going, Dr. Zero? Feel free to hang out or ask any questions. Yeah, it's a Q&A, but you don't have to ask anything if you don't want to, but if you would like to, feel free. Let's see. How important, i.e. effective, is intention? Well, I always say that intention is 9/10 of the issue when it comes to psychological or occult matters. They say that possession is 9/10 of the law. I believe that intention is 9/10 of the issue. All right. Hey, Ambient Esoterica, welcome, welcome, welcome. Got a couple other. Both of these people who have chatted so far have channels of their own. Dr. Zero and Ambient Esoterica are both channels as well. I would definitely check them out. They've got some very interesting stuff. Hannah, am I a demonologist? It depends what you mean by that. I have studied demonology and the hierarchies of demons as well as angels. If you would consider that to be a demonologist, then yes. Am I a demonolatrist or do I worship demons? No. But I have studied them quite extensively over the last 20 years. Welcome to the stream, by the way. Next question. Can you share some techniques for strengthening your subtle senses? Okay, so by subtle senses, I assume you mean clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, things like that. I suggest beginning with clairsentience, which is the ability to sense and feel subtle energies and subtle things. This can be anything from the electromagnetism of another human being all the way to something completely non-physical like a so-called spirit or something like that. The reason that I suggest starting with clairsentience is because if you develop your clairvoyance first, a spirit can appear as in any number of forms. I mentioned this a little bit in last night's stream. A spirit can appear and a single spirit can appear in multiple ways, let alone the plethora, the myriad of spirits that there are. They can appear in infinite number of ways. So if you develop your clairvoyance first, or your astral vision, whatever you want to call it, you're likely to be tricked and deceived, for better and worse. If you develop your clairaudience, or your capacity to hear non-physical things, you can be told things that aren't true. And I have counseled and helped several people who have a hard time discerning between their spiritual guides and their impulses, or unconscious processes that they're unaware of. If you develop your clairsentience first, or your capacity for empathy, we'll say, in this context, you can tell when something's messing with you. You can tell when you're being manipulated. You can tell, regardless of, even if something looks like a bright angel or something, if your intuition and your instinct and your intellect are all integrated, you can tell when you're being fucked with. Some techniques would be, okay, so for clairsentience, I had videos about this, but you're going to essentially stretch and compress your etheric force, or your chi, or your prana, your proprioception, your capacity to sense the various parts of yourself. So if you bring your awareness to the tip of your nose, and then you sort of scan your body down without touching, just sort of sensing down to your shoulder, and then maybe down to your elbow. Um, Moving this around, stretching it, densifying it, compressing it is a really good technique for developing clairsentience. You can also try to, whenever you're whenever you're calm and you're not actually feeling angry, you can start to try to generate something that approximates a feeling of minor anger or minor happiness, things like that. Learning to just shift without allowing it to fully pull you into the vortex. For clairaudience, you can first imagine the voice of someone that you know very well, and you can imagine them saying things to you that you don't on in memory have, messages of them talking to you. Or you can imagine the sound of an instrument. um, Many people have a hard time turning this off. People who constantly have a song playing in their head tend to be very gifted with, like, say if I were thinking something very, very intensely, they might say it as well, or they might say it out loud rather, or they might be feeling it as well, just because the sound can translate to feeling. If I mention the word happiness, that sound can translate into the feeling of being happy. So, all right. Hannah says, I used to pray and leave my body and go places. Is that normal? Well, it's normal for some of us. It's normal for more artistic people. It's normal for people who are less obsessed with physicality and realize that there might be something else behind the curtain, so to speak. So if you got into really, really long prayer or if you got into very passionate prayer, absolutely that can trigger your endocrine system. At a physical level, it can trigger your hormones and your neurotransmitters and your endocrine system. It can trigger your central nervous system. On a spiritual level, what you're doing is you're dissolving from the ego and you are focusing and honing in on something else. So yeah, if you're praying, or if you're fasting, or if you have a really intense religious experience, that can tend to be, that can trigger physical things as well. So vice versa, we can trigger spiritual experiences using physical materials and techniques. All Master, how's it going? When do you find yourself deciding when to switch to another path or technique or method? That is a good question. Stagnation is one key point. If I feel like I'm plateauing, then I might switch something up. If I've been doing something for a while, that's another trigger for that. Or sometimes life will just bring about a new path. Someone will talk about something that'll really get you salivating, spiritually speaking. Those are pretty good indicators. Let's see. Deciding when to switch to another path. So, do you mean like path working, like switch to a different like path on the tree, or I think you just mean more generally? If I want to switch a technique, typically that will be out of curiosity. So, like if I always used blue candles for color magic, fair enough. Oh, generally, okay. Yeah, so like if I always used blue candles for color magic because of Jupiter relating to the Wheel of Fortune, is one example. I might try a green candle just to see if it works any better. Yeah, or if something isn't working for me that used to work, that can be another sign as well. Any other questions? Feel free to ask everybody that's watching. I'm gonna keep reading. Let's see. Ambient Esoterica says, for me, it's synchronicities. Yep, little winks that hint at connections. Absolutely. The synchronicities and serendipities are really one of the coolest parts of the path, in my opinion. I've followed one synchronicity into another into mind blowing circumstances. There's no way that this is happening. Like, and just one thing after another after another. So yes, I love the synchronicities and the coincidences as well. Coates McGoats says green candle plus jar plus graveyard dirt. Good trap for bad entities. Interesting. I've got some graveyard dirt over there in my jar too. I love the idea of using like spell components and natural things, practical magic. That's one of my favorite things to do. I like to do physical things like candles and jar spells and things like that combined with imaginative and energetic techniques. One of the things that I try to share with people is the idea of combining multiple levels of yourself, not just using sigils in your mind or not just using energy work. If you can bring your wind or your psychological self in line with your fire or your energetic self, and your water or your memory and your imagination, and your physicality via gestures or incense and things, you're bringing the intention through every single part of yourself, which increases its likelihood of manifesting, in my experience. Okay, when did you first find yourself in that predicament, synchronization and such? Hmm. When did I first find myself in the predicament of synchronization? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, unless you're talking about the one that I was getting my mind blown on. Let's see. How do y'all use graveyard dirt, combining multiple levels of yourself? You did something there for me in my practices. I am very, 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 very glad to hear that. If there's one thing that I've noticed as a mentor and a counselor, the number one thing that people seem to be leaving out, either through just forgetting or not knowing, using all of yourself is oftentimes better than like a full blown hour long ceremony. If you can just get yourself in line, your will just strike the earth like a lightning bolt. how do I use graveyard dirt? Well, sometimes I will use graveyard dirt for, so like I have, let's see, where's that at? I've got a jar over here that I made for Saint Cyprian. So this is like sort of a spell focus, I guess, of sorts that is I sealed with candle wax and put a sigil on there. So this is something that I use for meditating and um, path working in more infernal or dead underworld places. Another way, I mean, you can use graveyard dirt for baneful, obviously. You can use it to end addiction, right? Bury the addiction. You can use graveyard dirt for connecting with your ancestors. That's another thing that I use this jar for, as well as like ancestral work and things like that. I will continue to read questions until we get some more. Feel free to blow them up. We've got like 100 questions here, but we don't have to get through them all tonight. Let's see. How can I create my own magical system? Well, first I would study a system. You gotta, as somebody once said, you have to learn the laws before you can start to break them, or you have to learn all the rules before you can start to break them. So study one system in depth. Get to the point where the system has actually changed you to some degree. It's made changes. You've noticed positive changes, that is, and make sure that you understand why those changes are occurring and how they're affecting you, and then you can begin to calcinate, so to speak, that tradition, and perhaps dissolve and separate and conjunct your own practice. Coach says so many fakes on live, but you get it. I'm gonna sub. I appreciate that. I've got over 100 videos, and I plan to make hundreds more if life allows. Feel free to chime in with more comments or questions. All right. Is as above, so below always the case? I don't know. It seems to be that way. That it seems that's why all of this works in the first place. What happens in our mind tends to manifest physically. Uh, thoughts become feelings, become action, become more thoughts, or we could think of it the other way. I think so. It's a good question. I don't know the answer. It seems that way. Is ceremonial magic even necessary anymore? I'm not sure it ever was. It's one way. They say there's more than one way to skin a cat. I'm not sure ceremonial magic was ever necessary, but here we are. It is a formula for creating psychological change. The idea of ritual is nothing new, certainly. Every culture has had ritual since time immemorial. Now, it depends what you mean by ceremonial magic. It depends what you mean by that. Do you mean, is it necessary to put on a robe and wave a wand around in the air? Not if you understand why one would put a robe on. One reason that people wear robes for rituals is because you take off your day-to-day solar consciousness, because the intellect and the ego is not what is performing the great work. It's something more subtle, and it might be a part of us, or it might be something else that is breathing life into us in the moment. But when you take off your blue jeans and your Carhartt and stuff, and you put on something else, it's symbolic of becoming something else, at least. And all of the ceremonial implements are symbolic. Most of you watching probably understand that already. Not that this person doesn't. All right, moving on. How do you assess the efficacy of your workings? Well, it's a little bit self-explanatory. Did it work or didn't it? But I think they mean, like, out of a scale of 1 to 10, like something can work, like you can cause a change in your consciousness or in your environment to some degree, a small degree, where you can do it a lot. So I guess the way that I judge my efficacy personally is based on previous experiments and based on my expectation, somewhere in between there. I try to have pretty grounded expectations, and I try to keep a good journal. So, and that's another thing. If there's two things that people aren't doing enough that I think they should be, one is uniting their fields, getting all four of their elements in line, and the other is keeping a journal. You should at least be keeping like a day-to-day journal slash dream journal, if not also like a journal of the things that you want or your workings. Is magical practice a daily thing? I don't think it's possible to live without doing magic. I think that the very act of living is such a magical thing. Every single thing that we do seems to come from somewhere subtle, and we seem to be translating that via our perception. I've talked about this a little bit in the intro to the book, where like you are transforming your environment via your perception. The difference between a club and kindling is your perspective of your environment. The same stick that can be lit on fire to keep you safe can be cracked over somebody's head if need be. Is it a daily thing? For me, it is. I think the deeper you are, like the more a part of your life it is. So for me, I don't really differentiate between my spiritual life and my mundane life, because my mundane life is very spiritual, but not everyone has that privilege. Not everyone has that capacity. I think if you just started, there's danger and obsession if you're doing it every single day. And I think that you should question why you're wanting to get into quote unquote magic or spirituality in the first place. But if you're just getting into it, it doesn't necessarily have to be a daily thing. Just keep it in your rotation. Just make sure that you're not forgetting about it, because life likes to throw 1,000 things at us and see how much we can catch and juggle. LBRP every day at minimum to retain connection. That's an interesting take. I definitely have heard that from a lot of people. That is a very common thought. When I was doing LBRP every day, when I first started, I felt like I killed my spiritual life. I felt like when I was doing LBRP every single day, I was banishing everything out of my sphere. And I almost quit practicing magic. And then I thought about, I believe it was Aristotle. He said, like, horror vacui, which means nature abhors a void, essentially. And I realized that when you banish, you need to invoke as well. So then I started doing the invoking in the mornings, the LIRP in the mornings, and then the LBRP in the evenings. And for me personally, and for a few other people I know, that worked really well. But I think the LBRP every day is the idea of it. I think is a good idea, because what you're doing is you're banishing. Well, the idea is that you're banishing earthly influence. You're banishing all of the carnal pleasures and desires and things like that. If you're just now joining us, we're doing a live Q&A about esoteric philosophy and the occult, essentially. And we are reading some pre-made questions and some chat questions. Okay, moving on. How important are correspondences to you? For those of you who don't know, correspondences, the idea of a correspondence is the idea that a force like Mars or Aries could be represented by, say, the color red. Or the idea of love could be represented by the color pink or green. This is what's known as the doctrine of correspondences. This is, in my opinion, the basis of all magic. This is the expression of as above, so below. The doctrine of correspondences comes from the seven Hermetic principles, and if you don't know what those are, look into the Three Initiates or William Walker Atkinson. The seven Hermetic principles are crucial. I guess I'll list them. They are vibration, which says that everything is in vibration at all times. Nothing is ever resting. The second one is correspondence, which is as above, so below. Essentially, what happens above happens below. Then there is the law of vibration. Or wait, sorry, the first law is the law of mentalism. I misspoke. Sorry. That the universe is mental. Everything exists within a sort of thought field. And then within that thought field, everything is vibrating. Nothing is resting. And then, because of that, there is correspondence. From the correspondence, we get vibration. And then from vibration, we get rhythm. Things will go back and forth, or actually it's polarity. I'm butchering these, I'm so sorry. After vibration is polarity. When things vibrate, they'll go positive, negative. And everything sort of does this. Everything has a pole. Sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're sad. And then after polarity, we get into rhythm. The idea that something goes this way, well, it's going to go that way. The pendulum swings and then it swings the other way. And then after that, we get the law of types or gender, which says, well, if things can go back and forth, then things might have two natures. And then we get into soft and hard and how that's a relative term. And then after that, we have what is the final law? Why am I forgetting the final law? Cause and effect. Causation is the final hermetic principle, which says that every cause has an effect. So this is where, as far as I know, off the top of my head, the doctrine of correspondences come from. And I think that they're crucial in magic. I think that if you want to cause change in a direct way and not do it blindly, plotting correspondences is sort of like breadcrumbs or coordinates. You're saying, I don't just want this to happen, I want it to happen in this way. And I want to use these forces to make it happen. Like you could say, oh, I want this person made me mad and I want them dealt with. Okay, well, do you want a martial Aryan, like Ares military force to deal with them? Or do you want a Venusian sort of compassionate force dealing with them? By using correspondences, we really hone in and narrow our intentions, so to speak. Not to mention, we really compress the idea. All right, moving on, unless anyone has any questions. Do you time your workings by the moon? Sometimes I do. So I will do like workings at certain phases of the moon. So, as most of you know, a new moon is a good time for beginning new things. The first quarter moon is a good time for like actually starting. So you're planning things on the new moon, or you're like beginning to initiate them. By the first quarter, like you're making your steps, you're actually making practical measures. By the half moon, we are like essentially in a like reflective sort of phase, looking back a little bit, looking forward. By doing this, we can keep ourself regulated. But I'm not like waiting on a moon phase to do a working or a meditation. I used to, but not anymore. No. What is the best way to ground and center after a working? So, just feeling gravity, just feeling your bones, feeling the breath enter your nose. Some people like to eat. I try not to just like eat every time I need to ground, because you can train your dopamine system to create cortisol and make you eat because it releases dopamine. So if you're just eating after every single ceremony to ground, all it takes is for your body to unground you to get you to eat, because, well, how the fuck else are you going to ground? So actually knowing to feel your gravity, feel your feet against the ground, go for a walk, touch grass. You can clear your mind and just do like a sort of void meditation. You can do what I call the magnetic breath, which is it slows your heart rate down if you are exhilarated from your working. Or if you, and the way that you do that is by exhaling longer than you inhale. Or if you just got out of like a meditative path working or something and you're like sort of out there or like really low, you can do the electric breath, which is longer inhales than exhales, and this will speed up your heart rate and wake you back up. So moving on. What's the best method for making sigils? That's a very opinionated question. My personal favorite method is it's basically Austin Osman Spars method, which is taking the statement of intention and writing it out, removing vowels, removing redundant letters or duplicate letters rather, and just compressing them into one symbol. Sometimes I'll use the wheel method, which you put the letters around two rings on a wheel and you just draw lines from them. Um, yeah, lately what I've been doing is sort of like I don't know, like if I was gonna make a sigil for money, I would just do like 3 lines for like the letter M, and then just like a circle for the O, and then I'll do 3 more lines for the letter N. It's super simple, super simple. 3 more lines for the letter E, and then make a Y, which I might do inside the circle. And then if you want if you want to make it look super magical, you can just like put circles to collect intention and magical fairy dust into the circles. And but all in all seriousness, the more intention you put into something, the more likely you are to make decisions in your real life that are going to bring about changes. Too many people open an astral gates, not opening their front door and getting the fuck outside and actually trying to make changes in their life. So many questions about like, how do I attract a hot goth girlfriend when they haven't even left their house in like 6 months, or like even made an attempt to increase their communicative abilities. Magic, it comes from within too. It's magic in esoteric philosophy isn't just about waving your hand and getting what you want. It's about recognizing how to create changes in your own life to get what you want. And if we don't know how to do that, we use symbolism, because symbolism is how the subconscious and unconscious mind communicate. The unconscious and subconscious parts of ourselves don't understand rational thinking. If they did, they would be a part of our rational mind. So we communicate with our subconscious mind via symbolism. This is probably the most common thing across all spiritual traditions, is the idea of symbolism. So I digress a little bit, but symbolism is very, very important. Okay. Can you explain the electric magnetic breath? Well, I guess I just sort of did, but for those of you who want a little bit more of an explanation, the why did the term just leave my mind? The central nervous system is comprised of many, many parts, but there is 2 major sections when we're talking about relaxing or exciting ourselves. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which relates to like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, faint, all of that stuff. And then there is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest, digest. It's more complicated than that, but you get the idea. By breathing different ways, we can actually activate the switches for these parts of our nervous system. And so by various breathing techniques, you can excite yourself or you can calm yourself down. And that's what I call the electric and magnetic breath. But they're known by many names. Next question. Oh, they said, I know you already made a video about this. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. That's what this is for, literally. Sometimes I explain things at an intermediate level and someone needs it explained at a beginner level, or sometimes I explain it at a beginner level and people want a little bit more. Don't ever apologize for wanting to expand your knowledge. All right. What is your greatest difficulty as a practitioner? Oh, we've got another question here. Coach says, mantras are very good for honing. Oh, absolutely. One thing that I've been testing lately and has actually resulted in some pretty serious lucid dreams and borderline astral projections is I've been using a 5-part mantra with the fourfold breath, so like box breathing, and it creates a polyrhythm. So you begin with the first part, the first fifth of the mantra when you're inhaling, but by the time you get to that part of the mantra again, you're on the in hold. And yeah, definitely get sleep and digest sleep. Yeah, sleep definitely sucks. I'm not sure if we can ever catch up on sleep. As someone who has stayed up long periods of time, I definitely feel the effects of it, and I don't ever felt like I caught up. But yes, I'm glad you brought up mantra. Mantra is very good. Mantras, mudras, both are very good for creating subtle changes in the in the psychophysiology, essentially. Okay, what is your greatest difficulty as a practitioner? For me, it is trying new things. I've been doing this for 20 years now, so I feel like I'm settled in. I can't believe it's been that long. So like I get settled in and I get comfy, but I do believe in the power of adversity, and I do believe in the power of challenging yourself. So for me personally, the biggest difficulty is trying something new when what I do already works. If I had to pick something else, because I guess that was kind of a, I felt like that was kind of a half-ass answer. Um, Staying dedicated without being obsessed. That if I'm being honest, bottom of my heart, like the hardest part about this is remaining remaining alive in my practice without turning it into an obsession. So that's probably the hardest part for me. For other people, I think it's staying dedicated. Uh, I think other people have a hard time. They feel like they're either doing the same thing over and over, or they feel like they're trying something new and they didn't get it right away. So the dopamine is like, the honeymoon phase has sort of worn off. All right, next question. What do I do when people ask if I want to accept Christ as my personal savior? First of all, define Christ. Second of all, define savior. And anytime someone brings up in a single sentence multiple things that need defined, it's important to address those things. And if they're unwilling to address them, then the person is probably not wanting to have an actual conversation. They're probably going to be speaking with rhetoric or obsession. If somebody genuinely asked me if I wanted to accept Christ as my personal savior, I would probably say to them, like, how do you know I haven't already? It's a slippery slope getting stuck in the swamp of semantics. Okay, moving on. I love alliteration, if you can't tell. Moving on. Ways to protect myself during astral travel. Well, do you mean like pathworking and scrying, or do you mean like astral projection? I guess it doesn't really. It's sort of the same either way. Um, there is preemptive measures that are often better and easier to do than direct, instantaneous procedures. So one, being able to control your own energy, being able to control your breath and your breathing, being able to control your own mind. If you get in like a flitting state of anxiety, being able to hold your mind still. Oftentimes the way that entities affect us or or harm us is by persuading us to do things that aren't good for us, or to think things that aren't, toward our end goal. So discernment is probably the best defense of all. Um, but other than that, there's mantra. Mantra is a really good defensive mechanism. You can use mudras. There are visualizations that you can do. I learned to get visualization down at a very early age because I still do struggle with intrusive images and thoughts. So I had to learn how to fucking counterspell that shit because it was like every time I would see something pleasant, like I would see like a puppy, like I'm at the park and like someone's walking a dog, and in my mind's eye, this puppy's skin is being ripped off its bones and it's just like spasming in the parking lot, like in my mind's eye. And I didn't want to see shit like that, especially when I was a kid. So like I would like learn how to like reverse what I saw in my mind and like put the puppy back together. So that was a good technique early on. But then I later this I just discovered or was shown this technique maybe as soon as like 3 or 4 years ago. It seems like it was longer than that though. What I call the shatter technique, which is you imagine in the screen of your mind's eye that these images are being projected on shatters like a pane of glass, and all the shards fall. And if you find yourself focusing on the shards themselves as well because you can't let go, you can imagine those shards hit the ground and just shatter into dust. That's a really good one. And then, but as we banish, we need to invoke, right? Horror vacui, nature of horrors of void. If you just keep banishing something, well, the closest spot for it to fall into is the vacancy that you just created. So what you do is you shatter that screen and you project a new image on the new screen that's behind it. It seems very simple, but it can be very effective. Do we have any more questions? Not yet. We will continue with the pre-sent questions. Let's see. Ways to protect myself during astral travel. Is there anything else? Mantra, visualization, energy work. If you're into crystals and things like that, those can be helpful. Incense can be helpful. Stuff like that. All right. What do you do with feelings of futility, especially in the Cliff-Off path workings? Okay, so it depends on the futility. It depends what you mean. Like, are you actually trying to do something futile? Like, are you trying to become immortal in flesh? Or are you doing something that just seems futile at the time? I.e., the way that this was brought up had connotations of the person said that they had experienced trying to not rely on, but trying to sort of like use the perspective of what they had learned from their spiritual practices, and the entity was essentially like showing them that like all of that was just lies. And like the thing about that is like they are lies. Like all of this information is a lie because it's being spoken with words that are just symbols. But the way that the information integrates itself within us, it causes a permanent change that is very real. Okay, so learning about the four elements can teach you balance that lasts beyond the lie of the elements, etc. Ambient Esoterica says, breath in the negative, filter it with an out breath. Oh, breathe in the negative, filter. Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. Absolutely. I like that idea. And I like the idea of the filter too. That's a very powerful thing. All right. How do you differentiate between jinxes, hexes, and curses? I don't really. To me, those seem to be colloquialisms. They seem to be regional. I don't really. I tend to define my practice in a very simple way. Everything that I do is, like I said, I live alliteration. Everything that I do is either under the pretense of a banishing, a blessing, a binding, or baneful. And baneful you could even look at as binding and banishing. So really blessings, bindings, and banishings. And I think about that as black magic. That is the banishing. And I know that's not how most people use black magic, but for me, green magic is blessings. Red magic is like bindings and things like that, or baneful. And then Yeah, green magic is blessings, black is banishing, etc., etc., etc. I don't differentiate really between hexes, jinxes, and curses. That seems to be just colloquialisms, seems to be regional terms. Moving on. How do you know when a target has had enough? Well, you got to be careful. What is causing their judgment? Is it coming from a contract that you made with an entity, or is it something you're doing yourself? Because if you've contracted an entity to do something for you, and especially if it's like an infernal entity, the job is over when they say it's over because they know more about that person than you do. And so if you are saying, okay, I'm calling it off, that's it, there is a chance, it's a very rare chance, and it doesn't happen to people who know what they're doing, but there's a chance that the rest of it comes back on you because it's a torrent, it's a waterfall that is already being directed. So, how to know when someone has had enough? I mean, be use discernment, one, and two, don't get yourself into something that you don't have the stomach for. You don't want to regret sending something at someone that is nasty. So if you aren't fulfilled, if you don't have resolve and you're working, don't do it in the first place. Divination is another answer. Moving on. Any other questions yet? Okay. What is the shadow tarot that you speak of? And what is it for? Okay, so Linda Filorio was an author. She recently passed away. Rest in peace. And she basically created major arcana for the shadow. All of the 22 tarot cards that are archetypal images are expressions of our divine potential, you might say. Well, we have infernal potential as well. And that is sort of what the shadow tarot addresses. What is it for? It's for the same thing that most decks are for meditation. The fact that tarot can and is used for divination is a consequence, and the consequence is not the purpose. Okay? Tarot is a tool for meditation. Now, is divination a form of meditation? I think so, yes. I think of tarot and rune casting as a complex Rorschach test. It's a vessel with which we can pour the contents of the back of our brain into, and it allows us to see things through the lens or the filter of the card. That's one way to think about it. Okay. Have you had experiences with DMT entities? Yes. I've only actually broken through on like 3 times in a single session, one time. But the way that I experienced them was very kaleidoscopic. It was like I was walking in a kaleidoscope, and it was like I was communicating with entities non-mentally, non-psychically. It was like very much feeling and understanding. It was very fire and water. It wasn't there was no gesturing, there was no earth to it, and there was no words. It was all just understanding and gnosis, I guess you would call it. Moving on. Let's see. Currency Riddler. I agree. Tarot is more of a tool to map the psyche. Love it. I love that. That's a great explanation. Do you have a favorite tarot deck? What's your name? Currency Riddler. Do you have a favorite tarot deck by chance? All right. Have you ever seen a ghost before? I'm not sure. I don't know. I talked about this a little bit last night. So, if I've ever seen a ghost, the closest thing to a ghost that I've ever seen was when I was like 4 years old. And my great grandma, whom lived in the house with us, had just passed away. And at some point that week, I woke up in the middle of the night, and there was this green thing. Like it was like a green cloud of light. I don't know what else to call it. And I looked over at the clock to see what time it was. I had a little Tasmanian devil alarm clock. And the clock was in its mouth. It was crazy. And anyway, I looked at the clock, and the time moved forward 2 minutes at once. Like it was like 11:11, 11:12, 11:13. Like boom, boom, boom. And I looked back and the cloud just like collapsed. So I don't know if that was a fucking ghost or not, but it was fucking weird, that's for sure. The classic, oh, I love the Thoth deck. I've actually got that. I have the major arcana of the Thoth Tarot up on my wall. I love it. Alrighty. How does making offerings work exactly? I don't know. That's a good question. So the way that I like to think about it is it's at least an offering of time and energy and resource. So like when someone lights a candle to Thoth or to Hecate or Hecate or Hecate, however you want to say her name, when someone lights a candle to her, does she get it? Well, I mean, you might say, where does the candle go? The wax evaporates, etc., etc. Where does the incense go? Maybe it goes to them, but I think it's like a sacrifice of time and energy and resource is a pragmatic, practical way to think about it. Now, if you can observe your offering on a subtle level, if you can see it astrally, if you can sense it etherically, you feel the essence of it being consumed. You feel the shell of the thing becoming before you. You feel the energy leaving it. Astrally, you can pick up on the impressions of the fumes of the incense going in a direction the smoke isn't, etc., etc. How? Oh, I already read that one. What is the primary goal of initiation, and can it be done alone? That is an excellent question. What is the purpose? Is that what they said? The primary. Okay, so the primary goal of initiation, I believe initiatio means to begin. So the purpose of initiation is to begin something. Now, what do we mean when we're talking about initiation on a spiritual level? We're talking about opening a veil. We're talking about rending a membrane so that we have access to something more than we did before. That's one way to think about it. Initiation can be done alone, absolutely, but it's harder because how do you give yourself that which you do not know? How do you teach yourself something that you haven't learned yet? This is why symbolism is also very, very crucial, because someone who has no occult knowledge whatsoever can initiate themselves into the occult by mere acts of ritual and ceremony and meditation. So they might have the poetic, artistic capability to sense that there's something beyond the veil. So they might spend a decent amount of money on like velvet, and they might hang that velvet before them in the morning, and they might take a knife and they might slice that veil and step through it every day, and that might trigger a process unconsciously, like, okay, start it up. That's just one idea, so to speak. Somebody could say, oh, wisdom collects in a cup one drop at a time, like water or rain, and maybe they can collect rain in a cup, stand out there for an hour collecting rain in a cup, and that's a sacrifice of time and energy, and they drink that water. I probably wouldn't recommend drinking rainwater these days, but you get the idea. One can initiate themselves, absolutely. It seems to me to be a more difficult process than having somebody else initiate you. Why is symbolism so prominent in the occult? So we covered this a little bit already, but symbolism is the language of the unconscious, or I should say, the unconscious speaks in the language of symbolism, because symbolism is more than just a language. It's the symbols are living beings themselves. It's been said before that subtle things take the form of symbols here, but on other levels, the symbols become living things. So symbolism is prominent because it's an effective way to communicate with forces that are not intellectual. And most forces aren't intellectual, so to speak, that we work with. How do you know what your archetype is supposed to be? Be careful. So I hear a lot of talk about like this is my archetype, that's my archetype. We're we're more than just one card in the deck. The whole deck is us, and then we're probably more than that as well. So don't just identify with the hermit or the magician or the devil or the hanged man or whatever. Your archetype is a pie, and the archetypes themselves are slices of that pie. Falling into the trap of identifying as a single thing can be very limiting. I'll say that much. So if you're fumbling and you feel like nothing, then I mean sure, pick an archetype. But the idea is to transcend the archetype, not to get stuck in a limitation of, oh, I'm the magician or the devil or the hanged man or whatever. Or Tommy, whatever your name is. Okay, next question. What is the difference between Satan and the devil? For some, semantics. For me, um, I tend to think of like Satan, the devil, and Lucifer as either three different beings or three faces, three heads of the same entity. For me, so like the devil, if there is something like a cosmic force of oppression and evil and degradation, then that might be the devil. But Lucifer, on the other hand, that means light bearer, light carrier. Luciferi means light carrier. So that might be like Christ. That might be the source of enlightenment. So many people do not want to hear that, but it is one perspective. And Satan might be something in the middle that acts like an adversary. Well, Satan actually does mean the adversary or the accuser. But the reason that I sort of see him in the middle of those two is because the adversary can sometimes feel very diabolical, but the adversary also can be very enlightening. So that's how I look at the difference between Satan and the devil. It depends who you ask. Everybody you ask, you're going to have a different perspective. Next question. How do you maintain balance between your spiritual life and your mundane life? Well, my mundane life is spiritual, and my spiritual life is mundane. But not everyone, like I said, not everyone has that possibility or that potential. So you can look for the magic in the mundane by extracting things that are beautiful or strange in everyday life. Because let's think about what magic really, like, what does the word magic mean? It means weird or unlikely or unexplainable. And what is unlikely more than something weird or beautiful? So look for the beauty and look for the weirdness in everyday life. That's one way. How else? Learning to what is that word? Appreciate symbolism. Because if you can appreciate symbolism, then you're never just having dinner with your family. That's another way to turn your mundane life into a spiritual life, or to find balance between. I suggest not really separating them unless you're in a retort sort of phase where you're not trying to talk about it or something. Okay. Next question. What is the most important language to learn when it comes to magic? Your own unconscious voice or twilight tongue. But I mean, if you're a Western practitioner, then I mean, Kabbalah is wide open to you. So why not learn Hebrew? Also, I mean, French, because Elif Alavi was a fucking genius. German, French, or Hebrew. You can also learn Arabic. There's many texts on magic. It's a little bit harder to distinguish magic over there, especially since it's a little more taboo. But yeah, I recommend Hebrew or French or German probably. Okay. What are some challenges slash benefits to solo work? That's a good question. So think about it. Think about being in a band. This is the way that I often explain it. If I'm in a band and I have an idea for a song, I have to open up, or at least I should open that song up to my bandmates so that they can insert their ideas. into that. Whereas if I'm in a solo project, like a lot of black metal and dungeon synth artists are, that project is mine and my muses. I only have to make room for what she sings to me, so to speak. So it's the same way with working and ceremonies and magic, because you have to open up your perspective. You have to open up the working. You have to open up your idea of what can and will happen to other people. And depending on the people, that can be a terrible idea or a wonderful idea. So those are some challenges and benefits to solo work. Next question. How do you know if something spiritual happened or if it's just a random coincidence? Who's to say that random coincidence isn't spiritual? But more specifically, keep track, keep an eye out, pay attention. What is it? Try to extract a commonality across the coincidences and see if there's something trying to be said. Next question. How do you navigate the more complex areas of practice, i.e., trial versus karma? Right. So, that it might be different for everyone. For me, if it's quote unquote karma, my whole opinion of karma is different than most practitioners, I think. But for me, karma tends to have like a sense of not nostalgia and not it's expectation. Like if it's happening, it's like, yeah, I kind of knew this might happen. Whereas a trial is something typically unexpected and also inspiring. A lot of times trials can be inspiring. How does one overcome the fear of their potential and stop self-sabotage? So now we're getting into the realm of the Jungian shadow a little bit, if you like to call it that, or we can call it something else. If you have fears, a lot of times they have been implanted in a what's called a neurolinguistic way, which is a fancy way of saying you took words and put them in your brain, or somebody else took words and put them in your brain, or you have created multiple physical circumstances that quote unquote reinforce your beliefs. Depending on how the program was put in place is a key of how to get it out. Most of the time, people who have a fear of their own potential, it's because they don't know. It's the fear of the unexpected. One, they don't know how to manage any more than they're already managing. It feels like I'm already doing everything I can. If I become more successful, what the hell am I going to do? Then I'm just going to crash and I'm going to be right back where I was before. And then I'm just going to reinforce this whole curse or hex or whatever you want to call it. So you can practice neurolinguistic programming, which is to start speaking. It's not just talking more positively to yourself, it's the way that you say things. So an example of this, a practical example of this, is a lot of times in football. If someone has the football and they're running toward the end zone and they're about to score a touchdown, American football, and the coach is sitting there saying, "Don't drop the ball, don't drop the ball, don't drop the ball." The person is focused on dropping the ball because the subconscious and unconscious mind doesn't understand not. It only understands is. So it's not hearing the not. It's only focusing on what is, which is the idea of dropping the ball. As opposed to the coach saying, hold on to the ball, hold on to the ball, or run faster, run faster. These are things that the mind can grasp and pursue. So using neurolinguistic programming is one way. This is a very complicated question. I'm trying to handle it very quickly. If this doesn't answer your question, please let me know. So we can use positive speech, and I'm not talking about just like deluding yourself. Make it something that you actually believe and can achieve. And if it's something that, and that's if it's been implanted lyrically or or mentally. If it's been implanted over the course of experience and practical action, then it might be something that you have to start setting goals, and you have to set or not probable, but you have to set goals that you can actually achieve, is what I'm trying to say. And you have to do them specifically. You have to do them in a measured way. You have to do them in a way that is realistic, and you have to set a timeline. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to do that thing that one." No, what are you going to do? How much of it? How many times are you going to do it? When? Where? So, setting realistic and smart goals, and talking to yourself differently, making sure that you are in a position to take on more. It's a complicated process, but I think that sort of handles most of it. I thank you for the question. It's a very, very good question. A lot of people have a problem with self-sabotage. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I should add to that. I think that covers most of it for now. Thank you for the question again. Let's see. Where are we? What is your daily ceremonial regimen? You want the passcode to my house too? I'm just kidding. My daily ceremonial regimen isn't that complicated. I used to spend hours and hours in ceremony and meditation, but these days, I think I just do it more deeply, so it's not required to do as much. But I usually do, like, I start my ceremony with, you might call them affirmations, but it's not just like, I'm gonna be happy today and I'm gonna get out there and kick ass. It's more like universal affirmations, like vitriol, or which stands for visita interiora terrea rectificando invenies occultum lapidum, or visit the interior of the earth and rectify what you find for the hidden stone. That is something to me that I start my ceremony with, because it reminds me that it's a process and that I do have to go in. And at this point, it sort of starts a chain of events in my mind. After doing things like that and confirming my other perspectives of my philosophy, then I will get into breath work and I will get into visualizations. There are certain gestures that I do that remind me of my divine will, so to speak. But my ceremonial regimen isn't that. I don't really do um, Golden Dawn ceremonies anymore. I I I translated a lot of Golden Dawn and thelemic material into my own paradigm. And for those of you who don't know what the Golden Dawn is, or was, a magical order, essentially, from the late 19th and early 20th century, and they basically had collected a bunch of Freemason and Rosicrucian teachings and traditions and conglomerated them into one system. And if you don't know who the Rosicrucians were a Renaissance group of doctors, essentially, and other people like that who studied the science of alchemy and Christian magic, for lack of a better word. So that all got consolidated into what was known as the Golden Dawn. And then some scoundrel named Crowley, Aleister Crowley, leaked all of their documents and manuscripts, and that was the beginning of the end for the Golden Dawn. But most of my practices are combinations of Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Western occultist principles and traditions, and I took what I liked and ran it through my own filter, basically. Moving on. How do I approach / overcome the abyss? Well, I'm not sure that it's something to be overcome, but it can be approached. My idea of the abyss is, it's not just one, like, so if we're talking about the abyss kabbalistically speaking, and we're talking about da'at, there's not just one da'at. There's the da'at of Atzilut. There's the da'at of Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, etc., etc. Approaching the abyss is typically just it's a symbol of the next path, the next part of the path. Someone who has never gone skydiving and they want to do something new in their life, they are on the plane and they're about to jump off and they've got their parachute, but they haven't jumped off yet. There's an abyss before them in more than one way. The way to approach it is gracefully, I think. Understand that life is made of many abyssi, and that we're going to be better off if we approach it willingly. Even if we're not ready, oftentimes we're not ready for the abyss that life brings before us. But approaching it with grace and understanding, or mercy and understanding, one might say. Moving on. Do I believe in reincarnation? Sort of. Let's see. It's more about integrating than overcoming. I agree. I agree very much. Well said. Well said. Do I believe in reincarnation? Sort of. Not in like I used to be a praying mantis type way. I don't really know how to explain how I feel about reincarnation. I don't think it's our ego that's reincarnating. If anything is reincarnating, it's the, I don't know if you would call it the Brahma. It is the innermost. It is the jewel in the lotus that is being carved into a multifaceted stone, I think. What real world effects do you think stem from a skeptic's idolatry of spiritual aspects in pop culture, inadvertently without their intent, so to speak? I think it can be enlightening. I think it can be freeing. I think it can be liberating. I think if you're a skeptic and you're actually trying something, it seems like you're approaching truth. I don't. I'm not so sold. I've been practicing magic for 20 years, but I'm not so sold on the idea of it that like I would be offended that someone were to like take something and use it skeptically. So, but this is a more complicated question than that. It's the idolatry of spiritual aspects in pop culture without their intent. So, I think an example of that would be somebody using a magical symbol or a religious symbol in like a film without realizing it. I think that is sort of what that's like something of an example of what you're talking about. I think if that's what you're talking about, someone who loves Lord of the Rings, for example. Okay. Well, I think that one of the power of symbols is that they affect us on non-intellectual levels. So, for instance, if somebody were to just stare at a circle every single day, like throughout the day, just randomly, like that might have the effect of creating circuitousness and balance in their life. Whereas if somebody were to stare at an image of a random squiggly line all the time randomly, that might make them feel uneasy, or it might make them meander in their life. So I think that even though it is, I'm sorry if this isn't what you're asking, but I think even though it is inadvertent and or accidental, I think it still has an effect on them. Now, does it affect them as deeply as someone who actually understood more of the meaning of that symbol? That's a good question. Maybe it affects them more deeply because the understanding of the symbol creates a sea of density for that to pass through. That's a really good question. I don't know. Maybe we should experiment with that on the channel a little bit. Initiation is often nonlinear as well. The higher self works in funny ways. Yeah, you said it. You said it. And that brings back the question of how do you tell the difference between trial and karma? Yeah, the self works in mysterious ways. That is for sure. Next question. Do I think what I do is still witchcraft? I mean, I don't know. That's more semantics, that's more colloquialism. I think of this as ceremonial science. If I ever figure out a way to do this without the ceremony and without the like, then yeah, you bet I'm gonna do that because I'm about efficiency. That's like I don't consider myself to be a left hand or a right hand practitioner. I'm just a practitioner. I use what works for me. In that I might be more middle path than some, but I don't know. The path is crooked, man. So witchcraft, I don't know. Um, and then that brings up the difference to me in what I call wishcraft, that which is what most people get into magic for. Well, wishcraft is like I want this to happen. It's like that is such a small aspect of spirituality and magic. Um, yeah. So I don't know witchcraft, voodoo. I don't know. They're all different. They're all similar. I don't know. Next question. Do I think Christians practice magic? Again, semantics, but yeah, most of the time prayer, convocation, the laying on of hands. Some Christians talk in tongues, communion. These are all extremely spiritual rituals and rites, and they come from pagan origins. A lot of them, most of them do anyway. Yeah, and I say that as I was raised as a Christian. I say that as someone that for the first like 13 years of their life had to go to church every single day. And I didn't just have to go to church. I had to dress up in like a tie and like fucking like leather shoes and shit. Like I was like my family was in it, and I just never felt like it was the full picture. I don't know. Christianity in my opinion is one of those religions where the esoteric aspect or the inner teachings of it is more hidden than others. And I think there's a reason for that. Okay, next question. Where do you end and I begin? Nowhere. Nowhere. I'm all of us. And so are you. Next question. What is the significance of silence in the occult? Okay, that's a good question. So silence at least acts as a barrier between ourselves, our intentions rather, and the doubt of others. Silence can also prevent you from draining your dopamine. Constantly talking about the things that you want to do is a great way to never get those things done. Silence also trains other aspects and senses. Silence is golden, as they say. How do I prepare for a ritual experience? Well, trance, essentially meditation, trance. I've got this room which this at the moment I walk into it, I've been using it for over a decade. So as soon as I come in here, I'm sort of in the zone already. But then I light candles, I dim the lights, I burn incense, specific incense. I really like myrrh incense. Every time I smell myrrh, I'm just sort of gone. So it depends. How deep do I need to go? How far out do I need to get? Moving on. How do you prepare for a ritual? Did you have a formal initiation, and how did it affect you? So, semantics. I hate to keep saying that, but so much of this, it's important to address the fact that most of these terms people are using, they have a certain idea that might differ from someone else's idea. So, yes, I would consider to be a formal initiation when I was 13 by my girlfriend's family. They were Wiccan, and I went over there for a birthday party, and they asked me to come down into the basement, and they asked me a bunch of questions, and the next thing I knew, there was like an actual cauldron, and we were standing in certain places and saying certain words, and before it was all over, I realized what had happened, and I realized that everything that just happened meant something much more than I was consciously aware of, but I wasn't sure what. For instance, her mom asked me when my birthday was, and I was like, "What the fuck? What does that matter?" You know what I mean? And based on my zodiacal sign, I was placed at a certain quarter. So that was one degree of initiation at a very young age, relatively. Another formal initiation was through a temple. I was a part of a Thelemic temple for a year and decided to leave because of personal reasons. It was nothing to do with them. They were all lovely, wonderful people, but I was entering a personal part of my path, we'll say. Okay. Why are occultists so obsessed with sex and blood? I don't fucking know. Well, blood is a very magical substance. It is fire and water brought together. That's one reason. Blood is also tied to the past and the future. That makes it magical as well. Blood is it contains the spirit. It contains the self. I don't know. It's a magical fluid. As far as sex goes, magic is a creative act, and sex is the foremost act of creation. That's one way to look at it. But yeah, I don't know why they're so obsessed with sex and blood and the occult. They just are. What is the worst consequence of magic that you have seen? Well, that's hard to answer because I mean, like, who's to say that it was a consequence of magic? Like that, I don't even know if I can answer that question. But death, serious injury, um, miscarriage, car accidents, cancer, tumors, like. But like again, like who's to say that the person wasn't going to get in a car accident, wasn't going to get a tumor, etc. Next question: are there spiritual currencies that we use to buy and sell, or hoard, or find ourselves in debt with? Fucking love that question. Time seems to be a currency that is spiritual. Focus seems to be a spiritual currency. Focus and attention. But as far as like rupees and USD and things like that go, I think the closest thing is etheric force and astral essence. That is to say, prana, chi, mana, vril, and your, I guess it might be your DMT and your ability to transmute that into creative imagery. Without getting too woo woo and making shit up, I think the closest thing to spiritual currency that we have is time, focus, and energy. And I think the spirits see our time and energy and focus much differently than we do. So that's a good question. I've never thought about that in that way before. I've thought about how money and how coins and things translate to them as energy and vibrations and patterns and things, but I've never thought about it the other way. That's a good question. Okay. Where are we on this? What is the relationship between the tunnels of Seth and the cliff off? So, the tunnels are the paths between the spheres of the cliff off. You could think of them as the children. That's one way to think of them. So if you had the frequency of love and you had the frequency of judgment, the path or energy between them might be something like parenthood or mentorship or something like that. Man, we have so many more questions to cover. Okay. Why have you chosen the darkness? I'm not sure that I did. One, I'm not sure that what I chose was the darkness, and two, if it is, I'm not sure that I chose it. Moving on. That's a funny question. Not leading at all in any way. Do you believe in good and evil and good versus evil? Okay. Man. So I don't necessarily believe in evil, but I believe in something like positive potential and collective positive potential at that. So that means that logically, I would also believe in something like densified degradation. I love alliteration so much. Positive potential and densified degradation. That might be the closest thing to good and evil that I believe. There is a book as a part of the Western tradition that says uh, something along the lines of he who condemns my works unfinished is unwise. And I think a part of what that means is that this isn't a finished process. It's an act. It is a play. It's a dance. It's not over yet. So we're still figuring things out. I think we're gonna go 30 more minutes, and then I think we're gonna call it. But we still have plenty of questions, and you can keep the questions coming if you'd like. How do you begin work in the Qliphoth? Well, it depends on what tradition you're in. The Qliphoth is a part of just about every tradition. It's just called the Qliphoth in Kabbalah, which originated. It's said to have originated with Hebrew tradition, but history has shown that cultures have intermingled with each other since the beginning. So nothing is ever really belonging to one place. But the way that you start is by looking at your conditionings, looking at your limitations, looking at your challenges, and looking at what you've repressed and suppressed. Looking at your shadow, essentially, and looking at the things that you're afraid of, looking at the things that you don't want to do. That's a really good place to start. And asking yourself why you don't want to do those things. Okay. How did you come to practice magic as opposed to other belief systems? I liked how hands-on it was. I liked how formulaic it was. I got into magic through chemistry, alchemy, actually. Um, I and through alchemy, I realized that the ancients knew much more than we were being led on to believe. And then through alchemy, I started practicing meditation. And once you start practicing visualization, like you're really like you're starting to open up some stuff. And once I started doing that, I never stopped. Next question. What role does the shadow play in magic? I don't even know how to answer that question. What role does the shadow play? Perhaps in creating a matrix to impregnate. It might be that simple, or it might be way more complicated than that. How did you? Oh, yes. Where did the names of the Qliphoth originate? Based on their qualities, essentially, based on the frequencies of how they act and what they do. So, for instance, Golakab, one of the Qliphoth, means the burners or the incinerators, and that's because that sphere or that place relates to typically anger and lust, and those are disintegratory forces. That's a very basic understanding and explanation, but it'll work. Some basic rules for invocation and evocation. Be comfortable with your own mind, your own energy, and have some capacity to control your imagination. I suggest before doing any invocation or evocation of infernal or elemental forces, being able to control your mind's eye entirely. 100%. Then at least being able to control your thoughts and silence them if you need to, and recognize when they're not your own or when they're not beneficial for you, and being able to control your energy, and being able to fucking sit still and just relax. Because doing invocation and evocation at least is going to trigger some adrenaline, potentially cortisol. And if you start shaking and if you start jittering and you don't understand that, you might think that you're possessed. So fucking learn how to control yourself before you start playing with angels and demons, because if you can't tell the difference between them, then you don't know what you're doing. Um, or not that you don't know what you're doing, but like then you don't know enough to be messing around with them. Is what I'm trying to say. All right. Next questions. Or next, yeah. Actually, I can give more on that one. Another tip for invocation and evocation for the people that are ready. Um, you have parts of you that are magnetic and parts of you that are electric. That is to say that you have parts of you that are receptive and parts of you that are projective. Mainly your energy centers. So if you're working on like invoking Christ, so to speak, like if you want to invoke Yeshua ben Joseph of Nazareth, um, then focus on the receptive parts of your energy and you should be able to feel. But if you can't, like the heart center is one of those, the third eye is one of those, the second chakra, just below the navel. These are points of receptivity. So if you're wanting to call something into you, use those points. Or another thing that you can do is turn yourself into a shell. Push all of your energy and awareness and proprioception out and create a vacuum. Okay, moving on. Where was I? Right here. What is the psychology of the night side? I don't even. If there is a singular psychology to the quote unquote night side or the Sitra Akra, the other side, or the Cliffoth, the underworld, so to speak, I'd say the philosophy of it is either, depending on how you look at it, obscure the light or hide it or imprison it. It just depends on how you define it, because you could look at darkness as enlightenment, but you could look at darkness as ignorance too. The philosophy of the night side is to not be the day side. I mean, I don't really understand the question. I'm sorry, but that's the best I have. Moving on. How do different traditions talk about the underworld? So before Christianity, as far as I'm aware of, there was no sense of punishment in the underworld. Before Christianity, there was no sense of guilt really tied to the afterlife at a major level. Most of the time, the underworld was just where you went when you died, or where you went when you slept, or where you went when you entered a trance, a magical trance. Now the underworld is tied to fear, and not that it wasn't tied to fear before, but people are fearful of the underworld because of guilt and Christianity to a large degree. All right, some protective measures to take when working in the Cliffoth. I mean, know what you're doing, know why you're there. Don't just go there to be a hard ass. You'll undo yourself. That's the purpose of the Cliffoth. Um, the purpose of the Sephiroth, you might say, is to gain, and the purpose of the Cliffoth is to lose. To lose what isn't you, to unbecome the things that you are not. So know what you're doing, have a sense of self, and yeah, be able to control your shit. All right, next question. Let's see. The fertile void, the dust. I love that. Yeah, people think about light and dark differently. So a lot of these questions, I'm trying not to get trapped in the in semantics. All right. Some of my favorite authors. I actually wrote some down here. John Michael Greer, Lon Milo Duquette, and Jason Miller are like the most probably contemporary and also grounded and knowledgeable people um, that are currently writing. But I also like Peter Carroll and Jan Fries, spelled Janfries, a lot. And then, of course, Thomas Carlson and Kenneth Grant, Linda Florio, authors like that. As far as fiction goes, I like H.P. Lovecraft, Garth Nix, Terry Pratchett. They're all good authors for magical purposes. All right. Some of these questions I was going over earlier before it closed down the stream. So if you're hearing these again, I apologize. What is your opinion on vampirism? Well, it depends what the fuck you mean by vampirism. Like, are you talking about sucking on people's necks, or are you talking about energy work and creating a magnetic vortex within yourself to drain other people's energies and emotions and things like that? My opinion on it is that it can be useful. I've written an article on it, but most of the time, I don't think about it as vampirism. I just think about it as energy work. Vampirism is just such an edge lord like title for it, because I use quote unquote vampirism for healing all the time, um, moving people's energy around, or if someone's overstimulated, like actually pulling their and like to people who aren't aware of this, we actually do have an electromagnetic force that runs through our body. Our spinal column acts as something like an electromagnetic rod. And this is where the idea of the aura comes from. Now, is the aura what most people think it is and talk about? No, just like astrology isn't what most people think it is and talk about. So, vampirism, yeah, it's a thing, but like I don't really call it that because it's edgy as fuck. But if you do, like that's your thing. There's probably things I do that you think are edgy, like streaming a live Q&A. Moving on. What is my favorite tarot deck and why? So I go back and forth between the Aquarian tarot and the Tarot of the Abyss. But I also really like, I have over a dozen decks, maybe like 16 or 18. I really like the Rosetta tarot. I really like the Night Sun tarot. Of course, the Crowley Harris Thoth deck. Lon Milo Duquette's tarot deck of ceremonial magic is really cool too. But I think my two favorites are the Aquarian and the Tarot of the Abyss. Some people don't like a black and white deck because it's less evocative, but I find that sometimes the colors leave an impression too quickly. And looking at a black and white deck I can really hone in on the symbolism. Moving on. Oh, I have a note here to say that I'm also making my own tarot deck. Yeah, very, very fucking slowly. I have all of them conceptualized. I just need to finish drawing them out. I've only got the major arcana drawn out and the court cards. The suits are wands are thumbs, cups are ears, swords are lips, and discs are eyes. So yeah, like the 7 of cups is 7 ears standing so close to a concert speaker that their ears are bleeding. In regards to mechanisms, what spiritual influences do you think inspire them? A gear, a cog, a wheel. I love it. Aside from cold pragmatism, when does machinery become artistic as well as functional? Dude, I love these questions. So first of all, I think that things like cogs and camshafts and wheels and gears and pistons are inspired by nature. And nature is inspired by, in my philosophy, the spiritual or subtle realm. And one expression of the spiritual or subtle realm physically in a practical pragmatic way is the electromagnetism and the void between the electrons, protons, and neutrons of an atom. Atoms are like 98% empty space. Well, that's pretty fucking spiritual and subtle to me. So I think nature rests on a subtle existence, a subtle framework, we'll call it, a subtle blueprint. And then I think that within that there is the inspiration for things like cogs and wheels and things like that. Aside from cold pragmatism, when does machinery become artistic as well as functional? So to me, anything that is open to interpretation is sort of art. So like look at Rube Goldberg, for instance. He made some crazy mechanisms. The whole purpose of his mechanisms were to be as convoluted as possible. And that defeats the whole purpose of a mechanism typically. So that's definitely art in my perspective. So I think perhaps when a machine does something or a mechanism does something at utmost efficiency, I think that can be art. Or I think the second the machine does something outside of efficiency, I think it becomes art. But who knows? Maybe every machine is a work of art, depending. I'm sure the engineer that made it, even if it's just like a fucking Keurig coffee machine, it's probably a work of art to them. They probably wanted to make it beautiful. It's an excellent question, and I love the questions that aren't just about the occult and esoteric philosophy and magic. Like I said, I came into this from somewhat of a scientific background, and I believe that by viewing our craft through the lens of other crafts, we gain enlightenment. Okay. Do I work with crystals? I mean, like define work. Like I like I like geology. So like I have like crystals and stuff. Now like am I like going around like talking about them all the time and stuff and like like trying to like I appreciate I appreciate the beauty and the structure of them, and like sometimes I will use them to influence me in a specific way, but like I don't know, kind of. Okay, how long have you been practicing? About 20 years. I started practicing when I was 13, and I'm 33 now. I look much older, I know. The void between hammer and anvil is probably just as important to the sword as the friction. Well said. Very well said. Man, I'm going to read that again. The void between hammer and anvil is probably just as important to the sword as the friction. Well said. Alrighty. How long have you been practicing? 20 years. But I mean, let's define like how long have I been practicing? I mean, I had an imagination when I was 3 years old, so maybe 30 years. I when I story time. I had cancer when I was a kid, so I was in the hospital for months at a time, and I had friends that had passed, and I was talking to them and communicating with them, and my family just thought they were my imaginary friends, but like they would tell me things that were not something that a 3-year-old would know or come up with. So maybe I've been practicing for 30 years. I don't know. I've been practicing every day very intentionally for the last decade. I started studying the occult 20 years ago, you might say. What are you reading right now? Right now, I am reading The Complete Book of Ceremonial Magic by Llewellyn. And I honestly thought I was just going to kind of breeze through it as like a refresher, but there's fucking gems in that book. Yeah, I'm only in book 4 right now, which is about alchemy. And it's been pretty interesting. After that, I'm going to read The Body and Its Symbolism by Annick de Susanel. It's a pretty interesting book, I think, and it's going to give me some stuff to read for a while. So I'm looking forward to that. Moving on to the next question. What is a beginner book that you would recommend? I love Prometheus Rising. Robert Anton Wilson does a great job of just running an intellectual razor right through the occult. He explains things very psychologically, very practically. He approaches things historically. I love Prometheus Rising as a beginner book. If you're more artistically inclined as opposed to intellectually inclined, you might try The Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. What else? What else? If you're just getting started, perhaps something like The Book of Tokens by Paul Foster Case. Those would probably be my 3 recommendations for a beginner. Do you work with animal spirits? I do actually. I started this in a very shamanic way. Which I guess that is something I should consider. I didn't just get started with science and alchemy. I got started with hallucinogens when I was a teenager, and that was very, very shamanic for me. And because of that, I found animalistic, atavistic parts of myself via DNA processes and meditation. So, yeah, you could say that's working with animal spirits, I think. What forces do you work with the most? So, I work with the elements a lot. I work with the planets a little bit. I rarely work with the zodiac. I work with deities like Thoth and Hecate, as well as others. I work with thought forms and egregores very heavily, sigils. I work with my inner light, you might say. I work with my shadow. I work with the Sephiroth, the Clothoth. I work with angels. I work with demons. I've worked with a lot of things, but the most I work with is probably just my own energy, and like the elements, stuff like that. I try to rely mostly on myself these days. Typically, if I want to do something for other people, though, like I'll work with, depending on who the person is, either archangels or like archdemons. You made me order Libra Null the other day. I'm sorry slash you're welcome. It hasn't arrived yet, but I feel like that would be a beginner friendly too. No, that is actually a great suggestion because it's almost an entire system in itself and it approaches it in a very psychological way. So I appreciate that suggestion. That's a very good one. It also has a lot of diagrams in it that are really good. So one example of a good diagram from Liber Null and Psychonauts. Where's my Liber Null? There it is. One of my favorite diagrams in this book is the diagram of the magical lineage. And I've got it up on my wall, but I'm not going to pull it down. It shows this diagram here. And it goes all the way from shamanism, which is presumably the root of all magical practice, animism and shamanism, all the way down to witchcraft and sorcery and the Illuminates of Thanateros, which is the order that this person started. But yeah, it takes shamanism into Tantra and Taoism and Egyptian Babylonian traditions. And then Tantra goes into Sufism. Egyptian Babylonianism goes into Gnosticism, and it goes through the Knights Templar, the medieval Goetia, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry. It just draws the whole diagram. And I think that can be beneficial for beginners to see, like, oh, wait, witchcraft isn't as old as time? Like, that, not really. No, witchcraft is a relatively new term and is typically tied to like Gerald Gardner and Wicca and Celtic pagan ceremonies and things like that. And I think that can be very beneficial for people. All right, we've got about 10 more minutes, and then we're probably going to close this down. Let's see. How did you get into magic? I've explained that already twice on the stream. Basically, I started dating a girl, and her family was allegedly like 3 generations of Wiccan. I don't know how accurate. It's probably not. I don't know. And then after that, I got into hallucinogens because I started studying like edible plants and things like that. So I started finding mushrooms and eating them, and yeah, that kickstarted a whole thing. So yeah, I got into it, and my grandpa was a ceremonial magician as well. So that sort of, he never talked about it, but I recognize the signs now. He was a member of an order, and he actually, I did know he was a member of an order, but he never could talk about it. Moving on. Have you worked with the Enochian spirits? Yes, I have. It's not something I talk about a lot because it's hard to express. Like, you can't really, like, the Enochian system has to be experienced, and it's so much that most people can have that experience, or so not that experience, but most people can have something as mind-blowing with less technique these days. But if you're really into like far out experiences and like alien machinery, I don't know what the fuck else to consider it. Yeah, try that out. Moving on. When is the book coming out? I don't know. But I don't know. I'm working on it. I want it to be quality more than quantity. If for those of you who are interested, I read the intro and preface on the channel. I think the video is called "I'm Finally Writing a Book," parenthetical eventually. It's like 6 page. It's like a 6 page preface if you're interested. Can you please share some breathing techniques and energy work? We've done that a little bit already, but basically, learn to recognize where your energy is in your body and learn to play with it and do that every day. And for breath work, start with there's three major things that I would say breath work wise. Learn to slow your heart rate, learn to increase your heart rate, and learn to stabilize. Um, a way to increase it is longer inhales than exhales. A way to decrease it is longer exhales than inhales. And stabilizing is as simple as a box breath. Inhaling for 2 counts and holding for 2 counts, exhaling for 2 counts, exhaling for 2 counts, or 4 counts, or 8, whatever. And it doesn't have to be seconds, it can be heartbeats or whatever. All right. Let's see. How many more questions do we have? 1, 2 more cards, 3 more cards. So we've got at least 45. Well, we've still got about 50 questions. So we might be doing another one of these next weekend, because we still got like 50 questions left. So yeah, I don't really want to burn through those questions if we're gonna have to do a whole thing. Well, we'll cover this one. This is a singular question, and it's a good closer, I think. Where do the elements come from? The short answer is spirit. But the long answer, I like to think of it like this. We have a unity. That is our actuality, our essence is a quintessence. It is singular. But because of where we are in existence, our singularity, you might call it, if you're into science, the term singularity is kind of an interesting choice there. So we're a singularity, and that singularity splits between inner and outer experience. And when that singularity splits between inner and outer experience, it sort of creates another split in my experience, which is mind, body, and soul. Or spirit. We're not going to make it that complicated yet. And this is where the tria prima and the idea of Trinity come from. Is basically, it's more complex than this. I'm trying to keep it basic. The idea of mind, body, and soul. So we have the singularity that splits itself. We have the singularity that is our true nature that splits itself between an inner and outer experience. And that is where like the yin and yang symbol and like the Tai Chi and all that stuff comes from. And then we get the symbol of the Trinity because between that inner and outer experience is something, and that's like the soul. The inner experience is like the mind, and the outer experience is like the body and the world. And once that Trinity happens, the interplay between the mind and the body is something as well, and the interplay between the body and the soul is something as well. And then it divides further into what you might call the 4 elements. And this is like thought, like actual process of thought and energy and memory and imagination and physicality. And then those 4 elements intermingle and intermix. And then that's where we get the planets and the zodiac or the zodiac and the rest of existence. So the elements come from the perceived fragmentation of our existence, I would say, or the dichotomy of dream and dreamer. you might say. Ambient Esoterica says, do you have any thoughts, opinions on Crowley's The Loop of the Zodiac, which has rearranged a few tarot cards? I do. My current opinion on that is that I think Crowley twisted that loop because it was prettier. And then thought, well, maybe that's how it actually is. And then that may have inspired a vision. The way that I think about Crowley is in 3 stages: the aspirant, the adept, and the artificer. That is to say, sometimes Crowley is speaking as an aspirant, as in he's in wonder, he's in curiosity. He doesn't make statements and factual posits. He's just saying wondering things. And then there's the adept, where Crowley says, this has been my experience, this is what happens, this is how it is. And then there's the artificer or the artificer, where who the fuck knows what really happened. I think it's very possible that Crowley twisted the loop out of logic and then created a whole fucking vision saying, oh, Zadi is not the star, all the letters are right in my book. The other reason that I think he might have done it, and it's not actually like that, I think he might have done that because I think a spirit like Iwas may have actually told him all the letters are right except for this one in Crowley's personal universe, because he was a little bit off kilter in certain aspects. And I think that might have been his guardian or his innermost saying, hey, you're all good except this one spot. But he interpreted that as potentially more than that. And that led to the twisting, because in my experience and my personal experience so far, Zadi is the star. And that means a lot of fucking things. But in my experience, Zadi is the star, and Crowley had an imbalance, but he may be much more of a master at all of this than I am. I really don't know. I think that it is a beautiful loop in the zodiac, and I definitely see relevance in Hey, the Hebrew letter Hey, relating to the emperor, or sorry, to the star as opposed to the emperor. And I definitely see utility and Zadi. So I said it backwards. I see utility in Zadi relating to the emperor and Hey relating to the star is what I'm trying to say, because the star is like a window. I definitely see that the star is like a window straight to Tifrith, as well as other things. But I think that there's the danger of over intellectualizing in the occult, and I think that Crowley was highly intellectual, and I don't know. I just, part of me feels like either he drew the loop or twisted the loop and then came up with the vision, or he had the vision and misinterpreted it, but the loop also worked, so he interpreted it as true. I don't know. I guess that's my take on it. Let's see. What do you think is the significance of rituals like wake up alarms, work quotas, and one's spirituality? In regards to meeting life quotas, does the Stoicism make us more or less in tune with ourselves? Well, by ourselves, do you mean the persona, or do you mean our true spiritual nature? The significance of rituals like wake up alarms and work quotas. I mean, I think it's to drive home the idea of time, uh, and in regard to, what is that word? Loyalty. Um, that's a good question. I'm not really sure what I think about it either. Okay, so let's approach it from a like the persona, the facade aspect. I think that when it comes to meeting life quotas, so like if that's self-imposed goals, or if it's more like a life quota, like, oh, you got to be married by this age and you got to have kids by that age and you need to be retired by that age. Does this stoicism make us more or less in tune with ourselves? I think that we are what remains across the change. So I think that it actually, as hard as it can be for some people to accept, I think that adversity is directly tied to enlightenment and evolution. So I think as long as it's serving your purpose of fulfillment and evolution and growth, then I think that you should pursue that adversity. But if it's stagnating you and it's killing you and it's making you feel like a hollow shell of your former self, then I think that that's probably not a good thing. Um, what is the significance of rituals like wake up alarms and work quotas? So there's something to be said about repetition as well. Doing something every day can help create integrity, which can result to strength of character. In regard to meeting life quotas, does the stoicism make us more or less in tune with ourselves? So if we're talking about like the spiritual self, the I am, so to speak, then I think probably not. Um, I think I think the intention is 9/10 of the issue. I said that earlier. Um, I think if you're going to work like it is your purpose, then no, I don't think it's helping you to become more stoic. But if you are going to work because it is what we do in this time and age, and it's how we sustain ourselves, and you can do that without complaining and creating problems for other people, then yeah, I think it will instill a sense of stoicism. All right. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I think we're gonna call it for this one. It's been 2 hours. I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, I think. But I appreciate all the questions. I appreciate everybody hanging out. Um, Last minute questions. Glad to pick your brain there. I'm glad to have someone to pick my brain. Thank you. Sorry, it's kind of hard to answer complex questions like that on the spot. They're really good questions. But yeah, I'm probably going to be doing this next weekend because I still have 50 more questions. And feel free to email me. I have a weird email. So I made a card specifically for it, but now I don't see it. So I'm not going to. My email is in the description of most videos. Man, that's crazy. I really did write it down and now I can't even find it. Anyway, I hope all of you have a good rest of the evening and a good rest of your weekend. And yeah, thanks for stopping by. Everybody have a good night. Take care. Thanks again.